Hello. In this short video I'll explain how to write a good methodology chapter. Please don't see this chapter as a chore. Done properly, it convinces the marker that you're familiar with the databases, have carried out a thorough search and articulated your choice of articles for review. Discussing the chapter with your supervisor reassures you that your articles do answer your question well and gives you a real boost. You can then press on with the critiques having made a good, solid start. So, I hope the video is helpful and good luck.
This video won't explain how to search using keywords as you're familiar with that now, but there are some accessible resources available on Blackboard which will give you some good tips. And while we don't expect you to do a systematic review, these papers are also very helpful, and there's some very good sections in the recommended textbooks by Aviard and Glasper and Rees. These books are very easy to find via the Library Services search engine, so I've used books and other media and I'm just searching for Aviard and literature and it goes straight to it. Scroll down and make sure you've got the third edition and you'll be able to click straight onto the website for the ebook.
So I'm not going to tell you about search terms, you've had that, but there are some cautions that I just want to show you. So first of all, I'm going through into CINAHL through the familiar way. And for the purposes of these illustration, I'm going to be searching for papers that are concerned with intentional rounding. So I've typed it in there. But the eagle-eyed amongst you would have noticed that I've actually spelt rounding wrong, and it comes up nothing. So first lesson is what's your spelling. Now I've corrected it. I've found 29 papers, which isn't many. You'd think there'd be a bit more than that. So I'm going to get rid of the rounding and use truncating. And I'm going to put the asterisk there and search again. And now I've got 31 papers. And if you come down to the second paper down, you'll see that that one talks about a nursing round rather than rounding, and that's why it's been found second time and not first time. But if you filter for academic journals only, that paper, which is from the Journal of Clinical Nursing, has disappeared. So I've just gone back to show you that there it is, the Journal of Clinical Nursing, which is an academic journal. So be wary of these things. Now I'm going to combine terms and use care rounding as well. I'm going to use a truncation, care round. So now I'm telling it to look for both of those things, and I've got 700. So there's a big difference depending on the words that you use. Now I happen to know that the seminal paper about rounding is written by Christine Mead, so now I'm looking for that within this set. And it simply isn't there. Filtering for academic journals, albeit with caution, shows that the paper that I know is seminal has not been found using intentional round and a care round. Here is the paper, and it tells you why. The keyword there that it's using is rounds, not care rounds or intentional rounding. So now that we know that, if we go back and lose the care round and just look for round and search again, there you will find the seminal paper of the third one down. So you have to be prepared to use different words and be patient. And also look at other ways of searching. So here's a paper, a systematic review on failing to fail, which happened to be released a couple of weeks ago. And you'll see that there's a number of articles identified through databases, and there's exclusion criteria, and they've reached 17. Having got the 17, then they look for Google Scholar and other forms of citation tracking. They found another 7 papers. So of the final 24, only 17, so about 3/4, have been found using database searches, and 1/4 have been found by using Google Scholar and other citation management techniques. Your initial search will give you around 700 hits, or maybe more, and maybe 5 of them will be used for a detailed critique in your final independent study. So how do you get from 700 to 5? Well, there's a number of steps. Each of them involves techniques that you'll have to be clear about in your methodology chapter. First of all, you'll use inclusion and exclusion criteria, but as we've seen, there are cautions here. In that 300 hits, maybe 20 will answer your question. How do you get from 300 to 20? When you found the 20, you can put those 20 into Google Scholar to look for citations, and you can look at their reference lists, and you might identify some more papers that you haven't already seen. That might give you 25 papers. And of those 25, you'll select 5, say. Each of these steps has a different technique. So let's start after the inclusion and exclusion criteria. You've got 300 hits. You need to get that down to the ones that definitely answer your question. I'm afraid this is where you need to do some reading.
So I've gone back to the original search terms, not because they're any good, by the way, but just to make a point. We've used dates as inclusion criteria here, and you may need to use some of these other terms on the left-hand side for inclusion criteria, but whatever you have used, sooner or later you're going to get to a few hundred. And what we have to do is look at them in turn. I hope to persuade you that that is not as bad as it might seem. And to help you, there's these two buttons on the right hand side of the screen. First one just expands, tells you what the paper is about. It identifies this one as a periodical and not an academic text, so we probably don't want it. It might inform your discussion at the beginning of your independent study or the end, but there's no data in there, so it won't be one of your final 5. Similarly, the next one is pretty much the same. It's a periodical. It looks like it might be interesting. Please read it if you want to. Don't have it as one of your 5. This one here is a pilot project, and you can see that there is some data. I don't expect you to read it now, but what we're doing is clicking on the right hand box there, and that's going to save it for later on. Similarly, this one we think it might be worth looking at later on. We're going to save it. This one can't be expanded, but you can be pretty confident it's just a opinion piece, because if you look at the reference there, it's only 1 page long, so I'm not suggesting that we need to read that. Similarly, again, this one looks quite interesting, but no data. This one is about intensive care rounds and telemedicine, and that's perhaps not part of our research question or our question to look at. This one's about pharmacists. Again, we don't want that one. You can go through the list pretty quickly, looking at the abstracts if you need to, or some can be rejected just by looking at the titles. Benefits and barriers, again, it might not be the data we want, but we do want to have a look at that. It might inform our discussion, and a literature review is always worth highlighting. So what we're doing now really is whittling down the hundreds into dozens. And by clicking them, we're putting them in a folder. You can click to the folder view, and all of those ones that you've highlighted are now here on the screen. And if you need to come back to this another day, you can save it. Now you do have to create an account for this. So I've created one for me. I use one. I'm logging in. I've saved it. You can also print it out if you want to. I'm just showing you here that I've cancelled it. Now I'm logging back in through the usual channels. This will be very familiar to you by now. So when I get onto Signal, I'm logging in again. And if I go back up to the folder, then that's what I've saved before. So all of the ones you've saved are there. You can print them out, or you can start another process where maybe you do look at them, all of the abstracts, and you start whittling them down further. Sooner or later, you're going to get just to the research papers that answer your question. That's how you get from 300, 700 down to 20.
So you've arrived at 20 papers. These are research papers that answer your question. Others that you've kept along the way, like the review of literature or high quality discussion papers, have been put to one side. These are just the research papers. 20 seems quite a few. If you look at systematic reviews, often that's all there is, and often there's many fewer than that. So 20 is a kind of round number for now. Before you whittle them down further, you just need to check that you haven't missed anything. And one good way of doing that is by going to these papers and using their reference list and citation tracking just to check that there aren't any more. So to look at references and citation lists, we've returned to this saved search. Now, I don't want you to think that this is a good search, because it isn't. We're just using it to make some points. And I'm scrolling down to a paper, service evaluation paper at the end there. I'm opening it as a PDF, and you're going to have to do that and save all the papers you select. And I'm going to the reference list at the end. Now, you'll be familiar with this. These references are going back in time. And the theory is simple, that if your paper is of interest to you, so might the papers that it cites. And there we have Mead's paper, which we referred to earlier. So if you don't find it through the search, you can find it through referencing. These papers go back older. To find out what papers have cited this paper, we use Google Scholar. So first of all, we've got to find the paper on Google Scholar, and the easiest way is just to cut and paste the title in. And there it is, and a box on the bottom left-hand side shows all of the papers that have cited our paper. So maybe looking at reference lists and citation tracking has helped you to find another couple of papers. Maybe you've got 25 or so now. We've got to get down to the 5 or 6 that you're going to review in detail. How do you go about doing that? Well, the first thing to do is just check that the papers do answer the question that you're addressing. Often they will, it'll be obvious, but this actually can be more difficult than you might anticipate. It can be quite fortunate. Sometimes, though there is a common thread, the paper just doesn't answer the question. So, for example, if your question was, does intentional rounding work, defined by a reduction in pressure sores, say, then a paper that looks at barriers to implementing intentional rounding, like the service evaluation we looked at, just won't answer the question. It's both about rounding, but it's no good for us, so you get rid of it. Often papers do address, to some extent, the question that you're interested in. If there's a big overlap, then it's probably okay. If there's a small overlap, probably isn't, but it depends on how many papers that you have. When you've checked that the papers do answer your question, one way of having a quick overview is just to put them on a table like this. You don't have to read them thoroughly to do this, but just to have some idea of the country and the method, what the sample and the findings are, so you can have a very quick overview, and that can help you select the ones that you're going to look at. So if it's about whether something is effective or not, some studies might say that it is and some that it isn't, and you might want to draw examples from both of those groups. If you select the first 4 that come to you, or first 5 say, they may all say that X is effective, and that might be your conclusion of the dissertation, but it might be that there's quite a lot of research out there that says it's ineffective. So you need to look at a body of research, and making a list like this is one way of helping you do it. So you found your 5 papers. Now you need to write up your literature search. How do you go about doing that? Well, one place to start is by looking at how published papers do it. So you'll find systematic lit reviews out there, you'll find narrative reviews, and you'll find integrative reviews. These are all different types of reviews, but they'll all have a section on how the databases were searched. You could have a look at those, but don't copy them. The paper that you're writing, the independent study that you're writing, isn't intended to be published. The reviews that you read will detail the searches, but they won't explain why they've used things. So they'll say they've used CINAHL, but not why. One of the things that separates your work from the published work is that you need to demonstrate knowledge and understanding as you go along. So there is a difference. So read them, be guided by them, don't necessarily follow them. Be clear. Use tables and flowcharts as appendices. Tables, I think, are especially useful. So here's a couple from published papers that we reviewed earlier on. They really help the reader understand how you've gone about finding them. And usually these are good to put in the text rather than as an appendix. If you want to use more detailed tables, then they can go in the appendix. But these flowcharts are really clear. I'd encourage you to use one. Be concise. We don't want lots and lots of words. We want to know that you've searched the databases properly, but really only aim to spend 1,000 or 1,250 words max on this. You need to avoid description. Now, this isn't a stylistic thing, it's something to be aware of. If you use the word I, it can push you to telling a story. So I used these databases, but I couldn't find as many, and so then I used that one, and then I went to see my supervisor, and Clive from the Hive was really helpful. It's that sort of story we don't want to hear. You can use a passive voice in this chapter. So say things like the following databases were searched, or the following search terms were used, or the inclusion and exclusion criteria were applied. So be concise in your writing. The $64,000 question is how many papers? You have to read a lot of papers. In our example, we've read 20 odd. You don't have to critique all of them, but they're all going to be useful for your work in discussion or contrasting results. How many papers do you have to critique? Well, I would say 4 is the absolute minimum, but it really depends how many there are. There was a recent systematic review on the use of protected meal times, and they only had 7 papers. So if you find 5 or 6 or 7 papers, that's all there is, I think you should critique them all. So it really depends, but 4 is the absolute minimum. And also think about how you go about critiquing these papers. Do you use a critiquing tool? The answer is yes to that, by the way, but which one have you used and why? Those are the sorts of things that should be going in your in the chapter. So here's a checklist. Have you included these things? Which databases did you use and why? Which search terms did you use and why? Describe truncation. Which inclusion, exclusion criteria were used and why? Did you do citation tracking, a hand search, reference list checking, like we described earlier on? How did you filter the hits in those steps? How did you go from the hundreds to the dozens, and how did you choose from the dozens to the few? And once you've the papers identified, how did you choose the ones to critique in more detail? And how will you evaluate them or critique them? Which tool did you use? A good chapter will have ticks against all of those boxes. So you're nearly there, but you do need at some point to go and see your supervisor for a couple of reasons. First, to make sure that the papers that you've selected absolutely do answer your question. Dissertations that don't do very well sometimes pick papers that just don't answer the question, and however well they're critiqued, then they're not going to be relevant. This can be a real problem. If you see your supervisor with the papers, he or she will be able to say yes, they're okay, and if they're not okay, you haven't wasted a lot of time critiquing them. You can go back and do the search. That's the first reason. The second reason is that you can get a real sense of achievement when you write this up. You write it up, your supervisor comments, you make changes, it's in the bag. You can file it, you don't have to do that anymore. You can put a line at the bottom of the chapter to say that the search was completed on such and such a date. You don't have to go back to it, and you can move forward. I've always thought that this search and this chapter should be undertaken before you go off into practice, because the critique, which we'll do another video about, the critique can be done in pieces much easier, I think, than the search. But we know that doesn't happen for everyone. But however it's done and whenever it's done, once it's done, you can move on.
So that's it. I hope you believe me when I say this isn't as difficult or as time consuming as perhaps you might have thought. Since I started the video, I've changed my shirt and grown a beard, but it won't take you quite so long. So good luck with it. Do let me know if the video can be improved, and do please keep in contact with your supervisor. Good luck.